Hello, my name is Marco Dozza. I'm a professor at Charles University of Technology, and in a few days I will start a new project, the MicroSAFETY project. I'm recording this presentation as a backup in case I won't be able to give it live. This presentation is about micromobility and how it can be safe. I will start by talking about the MicroSAFETY project, then I will talk about cycling, e-scootering, and about the future. What is the MicroSAFETY project then? Well, essentially, it's a long ride from Sweden all the way down to Italy with two main purposes. The first one is to raise awareness on micromobility safety. The second one is to collect some data for my research. If we look at the first goal, here are the different venues that I will try to reach during the project. And of course, you can follow me on the different social medias to see how this adventure will end up. But if we now focus on the second goal, the second goal is about collecting data. And I equipped my bike with a lot of sensors, but the most interesting one are some cameras that look all around. And here in this video, you see what I can get from the camera, which is all the dynamics of all the different road users as they interact with the bike. And of course, we are anonymizing the data because we care about privacy, and we are using AI to extract kinematic information that we can use to estimate different safety measures. But before we talk about safety, intelligent system, or models, let's double check that we are on the same page when it comes to micromobility. What is micromobility? Well, micromobility is transportation by lightweight vehicles. Why should you do that? Well, if you're cycling, there are significant health benefits that should motivate you to this means of transportation. But that's not all. Micromobility is also environmental friendly. And you don't need to think only about emissions, but also about noise pollution. Micromobility is also very inclusive. It will be viable even in low-income countries. And of course, there is a research showing that one car takes the space of 14 bikes. So if everyone would start using micromobility, congestions in the city would go down. So there are a lot of advantages of micromobility, but is it all good? No, it's not all good, because unfortunately, using micromobility makes you very vulnerable, and crashes happen, and the consequences may be severe. If we now talk about cycling safety, we know that is a big problem with 41,000 fatalities every year, 2,000 just in Europe, accounting for 9% of all road fatalities. If a cyclist dies, very often is in a crash with a motorized vehicle. And very often a fatality is the consequence of some head trauma. Speed is also very important. A small increase in speed may make a big difference for the severity of injuries or the probability of survival. Hitting a heavy vehicle is particularly dangerous, and the probability of dying increases significantly. It is not only about the fatalities, it is also about injuries. 1 out of 4 of all severe injuries in road crashes in Europe is actually cyclists. So we have a pretty large problem, and I gave you some statistics. But do we have any countermeasures? Well, of course we do. We have different kinds of countermeasures. We can use protective equipment. For instance, we can wear a helmet. We can also train as we do with kids, where we teach them how to use and master a bike before they go into traffic. We can build better infrastructure, like separated bike lanes. My favorite is vehicle technology, with a system like anti-lock braking system that will reduce the distance that you need in order for you to stop your vehicle. We can also make policies, for instance, forbidding to ride under the influence. And what is interesting, if you look at the timeline down below, is that some of these countermeasures will not actually prevent crashes. You can wear a helmet and possibly reduce injuries, but not necessarily prevent crashes. I will come back to that during this presentation. As for now, what I would like to point out is that there's plenty of statistics that shows that we have a big safety problem. But statistics are not good at telling where the problem is coming from. So we have also many countermeasures that are available. But if we want to develop better countermeasures, I think we should try to understand the problem a little bit better. Understand not only how many crashes and how many fatalities there are, but why do crashes happen? Because if we understand why crashes happen, we may be one step closer to devise solution and reduce the number of crashes. So what I suggest to do is to look at what happens before a crash and try to treasure that information to understand the causes of a crash so that we can devise solution. How would I do that? Well, I suggest to use naturalistic data. Naturalistic data is data collected in real traffic as users are performing their daily routine. Here you see some video from a bike, and this what you don't see is the face of this rider and the fact that he is using the phone as a navigator. And maybe one glance too much to the phone is what happened, what caused this crash. So naturalistic data is interesting because it can show you why crashes happen, but it's also interesting because it can show you when crashes do not happen, why they do not happen, what the driver does right to avoid crashes. An example of a critical situation where a lot of things can go wrong is an overtaking. In an overtaking, a vehicle approaches a cyclist from behind and may rear-end the cyclist. If it wants to avoid the cyclist and start to turn too early, it may have a head-on collision with the oncoming vehicle. And now that it's passing, we don't want it too close to the bike. And now when it's coming back, again, we don't want for it to sideswipe the cyclist. So all this data tells us a lot about the behavior of drivers, when it's safe and when it's not safe. And the reason why I focus so much on behavior is that there is plenty of research showing that in the majority of the crashes, the road user behavior is a major contributing cause. So what does Marco do with so much data? Well, you can do a lot of things. But what I do in my research group with this data is I make models for machines to understand humans, so that I can make vehicles more intelligent. And in a moment, I will show you some examples. As for now, if we go back to our countermeasures, well, what I'm focusing on is vehicle technology and countermeasures that may act before a crash happens to avoid for crashes to happen at all. In order to show you how we use data to make models and vehicles more intelligent, I will use the MiCA2 project, which was sponsored by FFI and was carried out by many partners. In this project, we look at overtaking maneuvers and we devise different models that can support a driver in different phases of the overtaking maneuver: the approaching and steering away phase, and then the passing and the returning. There won't be enough time to go through all the models. I'll give you just some examples. So if you focus on the first two phases of the overtaking maneuver, well, a model may look like this. In this figure, what you see is a car and a cyclist. And as the car gets closer to the cyclist, you see that these two curves change. Those two curves are the braking probability and the steering probability. So once the car is here, we know that there is a high braking probability and a low steering probability. But the vehicles also know what the drivers are doing. So if there is a mismatch between what our model predicts, oh, the driver should really be braking now, and what the driver is doing, nothing at all, well, maybe that's a good time to give a warning. So this is an example of how one of the models that we make from our data can be used to make vehicles more intelligent by giving a warning to a driver in a critical situation. Now, the overtaking maneuver is more complex than the approaching phase. Another phase that is very important is the passing phase. And here, in our research, we investigated what is that makes the passing phase safe for the driver and for the cyclist. And what we found is that the cyclist and the driver, the overtaking driver, care about very different things. If you are a cyclist, what you want is big lateral clearance and low speed from the car. But these two things are not very important for a driver. We saw in our data that the driver really change very little their speed as they overtake a cyclist, and they don't even often comply with the local regulation about lateral clearance. What drivers are concerned about is the oncoming vehicle, because of course that is a major threat for them. They are concerned about the presence and how far it is. Two things that the cyclist doesn't care about, because of course the oncoming vehicle is not a threat for the cyclist. So of course we can use this data to teach driver to think also about the safety of the cyclist. But the best application would be automated vehicles that may have models that take into account the safety of the driver, the safety of the cyclist, possibly even the safety of the oncoming vehicle, and try and optimize safety for all of them when they plan how the automated vehicle will overtake the cyclist. Now, there are more models and we don't have time, but I would like instead to make a summary so far. So I think I show you plenty of evidence from statistics that shows that cycling is a dangerous activity. There are a lot of countermeasures already available, but I've been arguing that if we can devise countermeasures that address the causes of a crash, they will be more efficient and better than what we have today. I suggested to get to understand crashes from naturalistic data that can explain why crashes happen, and to use that information to make models so that our vehicles can be smarter. Now, let's talk a little bit also about e-scootering safety. Are e-scooters as safe as bicycles? Well, we have some report showing that an e-scooter gets into a severe crash 5.3 times per million kilometers driven. Now, for you, this may tell very little because I'm not sure you are riding many millions of kilometers with an e-scooter. But as a comparison, the results that have been reported for bikes are 10 times smaller. So meaning that if you ride an e-scooter, the probability to get into a crash with a severe injury is 10 times larger than a bike. There is also a study showing that more than 1/4 of the people admitted that the emergency care, e-scooters admitted that the emergency care are intoxicated, and that may explain some of the crashes. Also for e-scooters, and even more so than bicycles, if you report severe injuries, the head is the most common body part. And again, 80% of the e-scooterists die in collision with motorized vehicle. That again shouldn't necessarily surprise anyone, because micromobility vehicles are of course more vulnerable than motorized vehicles. The last finding that I think is interesting, and I will come back to it in a moment, is that it appears that 30% of all crashes happen when e-scooters are taking their first ride, which is very interesting because it suggests that there is something wrong with the e-scooterist and being the first ride as opposed to other factors. So now I guess you expect me to show you some naturalistic data about e-scooters, but I can't because we are collecting them as I talk, and I don't have enough to make some sound analysis. So this will be for the next ride. For this ride, I would like to focus on the difference between different kinds of e-scooters and the difference between e-scooters and bikes. But before we go there, I would like just to make a reality check. What are the countermeasures for e-scootering? Well, the countermeasures for e-scootering are pretty much the same as for bike. So protective equipment, education, infrastructure, vehicle technologies, and policies. So let's go back to the question about e-scooters. Well, what we call e-scooter today is not the same as what we called e-scooters just a few years back. The wheels are not the same size, the braking system is totally different, and also the suspension system. So are they really the same vehicle? Can we expect the same performance? Well, at universities, we like to measure these things, especially because we are a technical university. So what we did is we put a bunch of sensors on bikes and different kinds of e-scooters. Then you also use some fancy equipment, and we asked a bunch of people to steer and brake so that we could see if these vehicles steer and brake differently. Here you see an example of steering to avoid obstacles. And here you see an example of braking. When we look at the results, we found that depending on the condition, some of the vehicles may have the same brake capability or less. What I mean is that we look at two conditions: comfort braking, which is what you do when you are approaching an intersection, maybe the light turn red, and you have all time in the world to stop, and you know that sooner or later you need to do that, so you do it in a comfortable way. Harsh braking is what happens when something suddenly happens in the traffic and you need to take action now and brake as soon as possible. So we try to replicate that situation. And as you can see, all the blue columns are taller than the orange one because in an emergency situation, you brake much harder. But what you should also look at is that for the small e-scooter, people were not able to pull out of the e-scooter the same brake capacity as the other vehicle. And this may explain why so many people got tricked on the first trip and crashed. It may be that they expected the e-scooter to brake as a bike, but the e-scooter didn't because our data showed that it just can't brake as a bike. So now to some summary about the second part about e-scootering. I think my main take-home point is that e-scooters are not bike. They are not maneuvering in the same way. They are not stable in the same way. And to the point that when you are in the same critical situation, it may be that with the bike, you may avoid that situation by braking, but with an e-scooter, the only way would be by steering. So I would argue that we need to have a close understanding of the vehicle so that we can prepare the user, train the user to master the vehicle in such a way that it won't surprise or disappoint the user in critical situations. So new vehicles may have different performances, and users should be trained, should know how vehicles behave before they are in traffic. And of course, if vehicles become different and, for instance, they go to different speeds and so forth, well, maybe there is also some problem with the compatibility with the infrastructure that should be addressed. Now, to my conclusions. I think micromobility is very appealing, especially in a world that is going toward sustainability. However, today is not safe, and if we want to make it safer, we need to understand why crash happen. My suggestion is to use naturalistic data because it can really show you why crashes happen and give some ideas what we could do to develop more effective countermeasures. We should also keep in mind that micromobility is changing, so we are addressing a dynamic problem. And if we want to address this problem that is changing as we are trying to solve it, well, one way is to use data and to try to use data to monitor this problem, see how it evolves, and make sure that we don't pass on opportunities on micromobility, but instead we try to understand how new micromobility vehicles behave so that we can contribute to a sustainable transport. I would like to end this presentation by saying that cyclist collisions are predictable and preventable, and therefore should not be accepted as inevitable. Now, this is a very bold statement, and if it was me to say it, maybe it should be taken with a grain of salt. However, this comes from the World Health Organization, so it must be true, and we better think about it. Thank you. Bye.